Hi, my dragons. Welcome to my den. Okay, so today we're going to start in our intro to victimology. Sorry for the glare on my glasses. I don't know how to fix that. Oh, there we go. If I look up a little bit. So, of course, we're going to start with the history and development of the field. And so I'll put the slides that I go over in the discussion today. And we'll pick it up. So I think maybe 2 videos will be enough for today, and if not, we'll continue it on for Tuesday. Okay, so we're going to start with the intro, and there'll be times when I show films in class about the way things were back in the day, and it was standard practice, and you will, after hearing how far we've come, you'll be pretty shocked to see some of the procedures that they used back then and think that that was enough. So after you finish this class, you'll be thinking, we don't even do enough today, never mind how bad it was back then. So you'll get to hear about how actually it was back in the day in the intro. So victimology as a field has been something that's been really overlooked in criminal justice. Remember, the title of it is criminal justice, justice for the criminal. And that has been the focus for a very long time. And advocates, victims' rights advocates, will tell you that the person who's left out of the whole picture, usually always, is the victim. So as a field, it has taken a while for us to get to this point where we should do more for the victim and take the victim into account better and to serve the victim, because everything starts with the victim. We don't have a crime without the victim. We don't have, any starting point without the victim. And unfortunately, being the victim of a crime is the nexus where it all comes together and where it all starts, the process and the procedure in criminal justice. So we have to think about that. And previously, the victim had been really removed from the whole criminal justice system, and today we're trying to reverse that and make it easier on victims and to serve the victims and to help the victims, which is, the way we're evolving in the field of criminal justice and in its own right, victimology. So there's been a lot of recent, and when I say recent, recent to me and recent to the field, remember we've been at this for a long time, recent is like maybe from the 1950s to today. So there's been a lot more awareness and evolution on victims and an attempt to reintegrate the victims into the system. So historically, when you think about the victim was really left out, and there wasn't much that was done on behalf of the victim, okay? The king was the one who doled out the justice, okay? So victims, I don't know if you've ever seen Game of Thrones or maybe some medieval films. So the king had a court, or throne. The king would sit in the court, and what we'd call peasants, the ordinary people, would be granted an audience with the king, and then the peasants would come in and say, Your Majesty, I've been wronged, and what are you going to do about it, basically? And they had what we would call today a docket, a list, an organization of victims who would come in and talk, and they would make room to hear from this victim or that victim. And the king would dole out justice, okay? And that's where we get the term court, okay? From the king hearing the pleas, and the pleas, like common pleas, court, they would hear the pleas of the victims to actually do something, okay? So you can see how a king, especially if they had a big kingdom, that became rather cumbersome. So in very short order, the king could not hear all of the pleas from the victims. So the king started to distribute and designate into areas people who he could trust. So here's where we get the system of lords and, all of the nobility. These were trusted people through peerage. Usually when we say peerage, these are like people who are related to the king. Like if you're not in direct succession to the king, not the prince, the heir apparent, you'd be a duke or an earl or something like that. So you're related, and you are related by distance. Okay, so like Prince Harry, while always a prince, he is a duke, right? Which basically speaks to his lineage or his proximity to the throne. Okay, so the earls and the dukes and the marquises and all those people, they would then hear the pleas of the victim that were happening in their own designated area. So they were the eyes and ears and voice of the king, who could no longer handle a growing kingdom. Okay, so that was the role of the king, to deal with the aggravations or the aggravated. We call that aggravated situation of the common person. Okay, and the lords and the knights were just carrying that out on behalf of the king. So historically, before that, the victim would deal directly with the offenders. Okay, so there were no authorities. This is, if the king wasn't there to enforce the law, they would do that. And so that could be quite ugly. A lot of vigilantism going on and things like that. So prior to that, so like if they couldn't deal with the offender themselves, let's say the person was killed, then it fell onto the family of the victim to carry out whatever justice or action they thought was appropriate. So you can see how this could get out of hand really quickly, right? And there was no judges, no jails. That's the difference. A lot of people, if you go home and you ask your parents about, or your grandparents or cousins or whatever, and you talk to them about the criminal justice system, there's a real absence of substantive knowledge about the criminal justice system. They just don't know. A jail is just a holding for short term, and a prison is for long term. But there was back in the day, there were no jails, no prisons, no nothing, so they dealt swiftly and most of the time unfairly with the offenders. Okay, this is where justice for the criminal, or criminal justice, came about. Okay, so the victims' families and survivors had to decide what action to take against the offenders. So if you ended up in jail or in a long-term situation, they didn't call them prisons. That's modern. In some sort of holding capacity, whatever it may be. That too is not that did not fall under the state to care for those people, those offenders. See, this is how we get criminal justice for the criminal. I keep bringing that up because it's not victim justice system, it's the criminal justice system. So the state's not taking care of them while they're being detained, deprived of their liberty. That meant that their family had to take care of them. So their wives or mothers or daughters had to cook for them, wash their clothes, do all that sort of thing. The worst place you ever wanted to be was a medieval detention center, whatever they called it at the time. And there were laws, some of them codified better than others, and they were sometimes for ludicrous crimes, which we're going to talk about, the evolution of crime and punishment too, because that's really bizarre. So they had to take care of them. And what happens if you weren't married, or your parents were dead, or you didn't have any children to take care of you? Going to jail or going to a detention, whatever that happened to be, could be a death sentence, because who's going to wash your clothes? Who's going to feed you? Who's going to take care of you while you're in those centers? And if you didn't have it, none of the families of the ones that you offended against didn't care. Like, oh, well, you don't have anyone to cook for you. Sucks to be you, so there you go. So this is how the criminal justice system came about, because the offenders were like, look, I might have stolen a chicken, but I don't deserve to die for it. Rot in prison or rot in jail. So the victims traditionally had to take matters into their own hands. So before there was any law, and law is always spoken about as a code. So before it was codified or codes, they just acted about what they thought was their prevailing social norm. So you could literally have the social norm of one area be the way it is in that area, and then you go to another part of the same country, just a different part of the kingdom, and it's completely different. So there was no unified law. Now, you might say to yourself, don't we have that today? Can't you be guilty of something in one state and not guilty in another? Absolutely. That is a real problem that we face because we have 50 states and it's not the same law, same punishment. We do things differently from state to state. That is a real problem in this country. We have a basic unified, like there's always going to be punishment for murder, there's usually punishment for stealing, and there's usually some gradation, whether it's grand theft or felony versus misdemeanor. But you definitely can, and you see this in a lot of different ways. For instance, the insanity laws are not the same from state to state. So you can literally, the best example is Jeffrey Dahmer. Jeffrey Dahmer, serial killer, kidnapped people, drugged them, had sex with them, killed them, chopped them up into little pieces, put them in his refrigerator, ate them at his leisure, right? He was found sane, to be sane. Not insane, sane, Jeffrey Dahmer. So there's Jeffrey Dahmer sitting over there. He's a nice guy that he is. And then you have John Hinckley, John Hinckley was operating under a delusion, clearly a mental illness. He takes a shot at the president, Ronald Reagan, to impress a girl, and he's found to be insane. So he's insane, Jeffrey Dahmer's sane. This is the difference between two different jurisdictions. So yeah, things like that play out all the time in the United States, and yeah, it's a leftover from some of the historical things that we've seen as well. So that's always been quite shocking to me, and how common it is. You would think that it wouldn't be, but it is quite common. So the victims got to decide at that time how to deal with, before the criminal justice system, before we had codified laws, what to do with their offenders, okay? And there were basically two things that they relied on: restitution and retribution. Retribution is, revenge. We're going to make that person suffer the same way they made us suffer, okay? To the same proportionate degree, okay? So you're going to get to inflict harm on someone just like they did to you or your loved one, okay? Restitution is you're going to make a payment in the amount sufficient to make the person, quote unquote, whole again. So that's a very odd concept too, that we're going to use money to make you better, okay? And these two things, retribution and restitution, are the very, very, very beginnings of the criminal justice system versus the civil justice system. And we're really going to talk about that in great detail. So if the offender couldn't pay, let's say we're talking about restitution, if the offender couldn't pay, then their families had to pay. And sometimes that debt just kept going and going until it was paid, okay? So we also have the old term lex talionis, which means an eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. Punishment is equal to the harm that you caused the victim, and that is definitely retribution, retributive justice. And so the victims and their relatives handled the problem, and they were the beneficiaries of any kind of payment. So that is the beginning of the victim justice system, those two things. I can inflict retribution or restitution upon you. And so lex talionis, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, is one of the oldest codified laws that there are. It was in the law of Moses, and it was in the Code of Hammurabi. So we're talking 2200 BC. It was very old and the foundation of things. Roman law also contains this, and it was a really early form of deterrence because nobody wants to suffer those kinds of things as well. Deterrence is a major goal. You want them to stop doing what they're doing, or prevent future behavior, similar future behavior in the future, that the negative behavior was so bad that it would outweigh any benefit of doing that crime, okay? So that was a way of stopping that. I'm going to stop here, and then we'll continue with part 2.